Right. We'd like to welcome everyone to the Southern RAC tonight, May 18th, beginning at 6 p.m. Let me start this just with a continued, we're still doing our COVID meetings format where we're going online. So let me read a statement on that to begin. It says, due to the continued presence of COVID-19 in Utah and associated public health and safety risks, large public gatherings are still strongly discouraged by the CDC and many local health departments. Based on these risks and recommendations, the Division of Wildlife Resources and the chair of this public body have determined that Regional Advisory Council and Wildlife Board meetings will continue in a purely electronic format for the time being. Anyone wishing to comment on agenda topics in the future meetings or to observe this meeting may do so by logging on to the Division webpage where instructions and links are provided. With that, I want to welcome the RAC here. We'll take a minute to go around and have the RAC introduce themselves. So let's just start at the top of my list. Austin, would you mind introducing yourself and who you represent, where you're from?
Yeah, this is Austin Atkinson, live in Cedar City, Utah, representing the public at large.
Thanks, Austin. Bart.
Hi, my name is Bart Batista from Kanab, Utah, and I represent non-consumptive interests.
Thank you, Bart. Gene.
Gene Boardman, Hinckley, Utah, representing the public at large.
Thanks, Gene. Riley.
Riley Roberts from Tropic, Utah, representing sportsmen.
Thanks, Riley. Chad. I know Chad's in a tough internet spot, so we may not have Chad. We'll see. We'll come back. Nick.
Nick Jorgensen, non-consumptive out of St. George, Utah.
Thanks, Nick. Chuck.
Chuck Chamberlain in Cedar City, representing the Forest Service.
Thanks, Chuck. And Verlin.
Verlin King, Bicknell, Utah, representing agriculture.
Thanks, Verlin. Dan.
Dan Fletcher, Cedar City, Utah, representing Bureau of Land Management.
Appreciate it, Dan. And I am Braden Richmond. I'm representing sportsmen, also the chair of the RAC, and from Beaver, Utah. On this call, we have a lot of representatives of the division. I don't think I'll go around. I will miss someone if I do. I also know that Donnie Hunter is on the call from the Big Game Board, Wildlife Board. I think, is there any other representatives of the Wildlife Board? Did I miss anyone there? Okay, I'll assume that Donnie's the only one from the Wildlife Board. With that, at this time, we take a motion to approve the agenda and the minutes. If anyone would like to make a motion there, if there's any other questions or discussion on that.
Yeah, this is Nick. I make a motion that we approve the minutes and the agenda as outlined on the on our sheet here.
Thanks, Nick. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Well, I was nervous it was going to fail for lack of a second. I was going to say we're getting off to a rough start. Thank you. Who seconded that first? Bart seconded, but was it Chuck? Was that you that did it?
Yeah,
first?
I seconded it as well.
Okay. So Nick made the motion and Chuck seconded that. Let's quickly vote on that. Austin.
Yes.
Bart.
Yes.
Gene.
Yes.
Riley.
Yes.
Chad. Nick.
Yes.
Chuck.
Yes.
Verland.
Yes.
And Dan.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll jump into the my notes, the minutes from the Wildlife Board meeting. Hopefully everyone had a chance to watch that meeting. That was a big meeting with a lot of discussion, some really good discussion. I think some good motions were made there. I will go through each of those. So there was a motion made to approve the 600. Oh, sorry. No, that is the first one. Okay, let me start over. A motion to approve the 600 permit decrease on the Manti unit and keep the San Juan Abajo unit permit the same as in 2020. That motion passed unanimously. There was a motion to accept the remainder of the division's recommendations as presented regarding the buck and deer permit recommendations. That passed unanimously. There was a motion to track the division's progress of the 2023 draw application changes with an update to the Wildlife Board in 1 year. And this is to be placed on the action log. So just to clarify, that's a request to see if we can improve the timeliness so we have better numbers as we're applying. And that passed unanimously to be placed on the action log, just to be clear on that one. Okay, the motion to accept the division's recommendations presented with the addition of 1 permit on the Little Creek unit. So this is on the buck or bull elk and buck pronghorn portion, and that passed unanimously. There was a motion to move that hunters who have drawn a tag are required to take a hunter orientation on shot placement of bison prior to receiving their tag. This motion was later pulled, and then a second motion was to move that the 2021 bison hunters will receive information on shot placement and anything additional the division would like to include. In 2022, there will be a quick mandatory orientation course for all bison hunters, and that passed unanimously. There was another motion that we increase the archery hunter's choice permits on the Henry Mountains from 4 to 6. That passed unanimously. And then a motion to accept the remainder of the division's once-in-a-lifetime permit recommendations, and that passed unanimously. On the antlerless permit recommendations, there was a motion to accept the division's recommendations as presented. That passed unanimously. On the CWMU antlerless permit recommendations, there was a motion to accept the division's CWMU antlerless permit recommendations as presented. That passed 4 in favor and 2 recused. On the conservation permit rule amendments, there was a motion to accept the conservation permit rule amendments as presented. That passed unanimously. On the Weber-Florence Creek CWMU permit request, there was a motion to approve the permit request for the Weber-Florence CWMU as presented. That passed unanimously. On the AIS rule amendments, dip tank, there was a motion to move that we approve the AIS rule amendment as presented, and that passed unanimously. And then on the Heber permit variance request, there was a motion to deny the variance request by client Heber. That passed 5 to 1, with Donnie Hunter being the opposed vote there. And then finally, on the Eric Richens stipulation, there was a motion to accept the stipulation for Eric Richens as presented by the division, and that passed unanimously. I hope I didn't miss anything there. I think I got it all. Kevin, does that sound correct to you? Any comments there?
Yeah, Braden. If you didn't see that meeting out to the end and see that thing about the request for a variance and follow that through and get an idea about what trophy hunting's come to, you really ought to look into that and give you a perspective about what trophy hunting is.
Thanks, Gene. It was an interesting board meeting to watch, but it is also, it's public record. It's there to view it if you want, and it is interesting, kind of where the board came from and how they made that decision. So also, just another comment, there was a motion from Gene in our RAC. He's asked for it for several years to get a list of the allocated permits by unit, so it combine all the permits on a unit. The draw permits, the conservation permits, so he could see all those permits on a unit. And Gene made a motion our last meeting, which passed unanimous. That went to the big game board, and they also made a motion, which passed. I got a call just this afternoon from Justin Shannon. I saw he just came on to the meeting. If he wants to comment, we'll let him, but I don't think he needs to. But he just let me know that their plan is by the end of this week, the division will have that on their webpage. So that's exciting. I know Gene's been working on getting that for a while, and by the end of the week, that'll be on the webpage. So any other comments there? Any questions on the minutes from the Wildlife Board meeting? Okay. Next, let's move on to the regional update. I'll turn it over to Kevin to give us the regional update.
Thanks, Braden. Most of what I'm going to talk about is really our concern over water or the lack thereof. I think it's a pretty pervasive concern across southern Utah for sure, and a lot of the state. We're working to, there's not a lot we can do to make it rain, but we're trying to do what we can to mitigate the effects on big game populations and conflicts with the agricultural community. I think everybody's aware of this, but we do have a provision that we will revisit our antlerless recommendations in the August board meeting if needed, if we need to make further adjustments to our populations of elk in particular, but also deer if needed, although those populations the droughts already reduced our deer population significantly, as you're aware. It's not just big game that are being affected. Obviously, fish need water, and maybe most directly, those impacts are being felt in our lakes and streams. Just as for instance, Lake Powell water levels are at historic lows right now. At the time when the levels should be coming up, they're still dropping. Wahweap is the only ramp that's currently open on this end of the lake, and there's only Wahweap and one of the executive ramp at Bullfrog are the only ramps that are open on the entire lake. And those won't be open for long if things stay the way they are. I happen to be down there today, and we're within a few feet of the Wahweap ramp not being open either. And so that's very concerning that it's happening this early in the year. It's not even June yet. With that, our aquatic staff, both in the region and in Salt Lake, are contemplating regulation changes on lakes where we know that will be drained. We will be making some regulation changes to let sportsmen take as much advantage as they can of harvesting fish and removing them from those water bodies while they still can. There'll be a first round of those that will happen in May before the end of this month, and then there may be subsequent ones coming out throughout the summer as we find out what conditions, how and if conditions continue to deteriorate. On a positive note, one thing that low water levels do allow us to do is a treatment that we've been trying to get done in the Virgin River Gorge for really over a decade, to try to remove an invasive fish species called a red shiner out of the Virgin River Gorge. That is likely to happen this year because we need really low water levels to be effective with that, and we're coordinating closely with Arizona, and we're hopeful that will happen. That's a really big deal. Those fish are probably the biggest threat to all of our recovery efforts within the Virgin River drainage. They currently don't come into Utah. We have several barriers in place, but they're right on our border down there through the gorge. And so if we can remove them from there as well, that's a huge win for us. So my hope right now is that we get that treatment done, and then the skies open and we get rain through the summer, which would be very beneficial. Moving on to our law enforcement, a case that I thought you would be interested in. In Washington County, there was an individual who was advertising big game hunts that didn't exist on property that he didn't have access to, and permits that he didn't have either. The Washington County attorney has taken that very seriously. After we were able to collect the evidence, there was an arrest warrant issued with 18 felony charges associated with that arrest warrant. And so that's That's a big deal. That's some serious consequences and they're associated with fraud and other things of that nature. We're working with Paiute County right now. They contacted us. They applied for an outdoor recreation grant through the governor's Office of Outdoor Recreation and received that to put a shooting range in Paiute County. They've approached us to see if we can figure out a way to put that on one of our wildlife management areas. We're hoping that we can, and so we're working with the Extension Service in Paiute County to see if we can make that happen, and I'm hopeful that we will. And then just lastly, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I'm still really optimistic that our Utah prairie dog conservation strategy, the way it's taking shape, and the case that we'll be able to make at some point to have that species delisted and removed from the protections of the Endangered Species Act. That won't happen quickly. It'll probably be a 3, 4, 5 year process. But because of the partnerships we have with the Forest Service and the BLM and others, there's a lot of good work that's happened, and I think we can be successful there. And if Chuck or Dan out there want to comment on that, they're welcome to. But I'm pleased with the way that's coming together. So, Braden, that's all I have, and I'll be happy to take any questions. You're still on mute, Braden.
Any questions from the RAC for Kevin?
Well, I'd like to make a comment that they arranged for me a ride along on the Dutton with Kyle Christensen the other day, and it was a real education for me in understanding what they were doing and why they were doing it with the big game numbers and so forth. Also saw a lot of dry country and not very much green.
Thanks, Gene. Any other questions or comments from the RAC? All right, well, let's move into our first agenda item. So the first agenda item is the HB 295 Waterfowl Rule Amendments. Again, the presentations were posted a couple of weeks ago now, I guess. We assumed that all the RAC members had a chance to review those. I also know that we got a lot of emails on this one. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to ask questions, discuss with those contacting them. Maybe to start this, what I would suggest after watching the other two RACs, Blair, I know that you have some additional information. I think it would probably be beneficial to start there, if you would mind just sharing some of that. Yeah.
Would you like me to summarize the comments, or would you like to go to Blair first?
You know what, actually, Kevin, I wonder if well, let's go ahead and summarize the comments. I guess that's the order of things. I was going to say maybe after Blair's presentation, but the order of things would be to summarize the comments. And then from there, if we could just go directly to Blair, if that works, Blair. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah. So I know if the pattern has held true and for our RAC, like as the others, you guys have probably received individually a lot more comments than came through the formal comment process. We had 8 comments on this agenda item. Of those, we had 50% of them, so 4 people that strongly disagreed with the recommendation, 2 or 25% that strongly agreed, 1 that somewhat agreed, and then 1 that somewhat disagreed. So pretty even split. The nature of the comments. So we had the Utah Waterfowl Association commented, and they have 9 recommendations that they proposed that I'm sure you've looked at, and really centered around trying to avoid conflicts with guides and some regulations that they would recommend. Some other sentiment that guides that there needs to be a permitting process. And then we heard also from folks that didn't agree with regulating guiding in our waterfowl management areas. Some of the sentiment went to the fact that guides help people get started into waterfowl because it's kind of a specialized thing, and it helps people get started, and then they move on to being independent in that. Some comments around swan hunting and that guides really make that an accessible hunt for some people that wouldn't be otherwise. And then some comments about, what's really the definition of a guide. If someone takes friends out and they're helping him pay for gas, does that constitute guiding? And some comments that way. So pretty even split between support and not support. And that's kind of the nature of the comments that came through the official process.
Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share this. Let me know if you're seeing that slide. Should be showing up any second. Okay, is that showing up? Okay, perfect. All right, so I appreciate you giving me a minute to speak on this, Braden. This will just be basically some background information of why we got to this point, why kind of our thought process along the way. It's also has a whole bunch of questions in here that I've been getting, so hopefully it'll help to kind of make it more clear in your mind, help move the discussion along after you hear some of this. And so what brings us here is HB 295. This was legislation that passed in the 2021 legislative session, which essentially made it or required guides to have a permit to guide on our waterfowl management areas. And so our intent of bringing a forth this regulation is to try to get some clarification on that. And so we can have something in place by the waterfowl season, which will start in September this year. There has been some concerns that we're just trying to hurry and push this forward, and that's not necessarily the case. We know that this is a weird system right now. It doesn't allow the public to comment, which is unfortunate. But I guess our timeline would need to be that we get on this quickly. After the June board meeting, we'll have to start trying to work through the details and issue permits. So that's essentially why it's coming through now, and we're not waiting for till a later date. I also wanted to give you some information that guiding has been occurring on our properties. It has been occurring for quite a while now. It's not something we've encouraged. It's not something we've stopped. It's basically just an activity that's been happening, and we haven't really done much about it. Some background information on our waterfowl hunters. This will probably be helpful. We have about 26,000 waterfowl hunters in the state, and that breaks down to be about 3.5% of those are non-residents, and then the rest of them are resident hunters. So the majority of our hunters here in the state are residents. And so in order to answer this question, we put a survey out there last month. We got about 5,500 people that responded to the survey. And so that equates to about 20% of the waterfowl population, or the waterfowl hunters in the state, and non-residents responded to the survey. When you look specifically at the guiding question, we had about 4,800 people respond to that. And so the way those broke down was about 97.5% resident, about 2.5% non-resident. So the percentages were about the same. And I know there had been some current concerns that non-residents didn't have a chance to participate, but looking at the data, we felt like it was pretty representative of the waterfowl hunters that we have out there. And so because of that, we feel like this is a pretty good representation of what the overall waterfowl community is interested in. We also had about 4 or 5 days worth of data prior to putting out our brown bag materials. So the presentation you had seen was based on about 4 or 5 days worth of data. There had been concerns from people that we hadn't used all the data we had received in the survey. And so I pulled the data the morning of the central RAC meeting. So anybody who had participated in the survey prior to that point, their comments were included in the survey. And so I'll show you some of the data, and that's whose comments we're going to be looking at. And so we essentially asked people, do you support or are you opposed to guiding on our WMAs? And we gave them 5 options to choose from to get kind of a feel for people that were strongly opposed or supportive of it, and then people that had less strong opinions or who were neutral on it. And so starting at the left is our strongly opposed group. And we had about 46.4% of people that participated in this survey that were not supportive of guiding on the WMAs. The next group, as you move to the right, was our slightly opposed. That was 16%. The neutrals were 23%. And then on that right side, you can see the people that were supportive of guiding. We had about 7.4% of people that were slightly supportive of guiding, and then 6.6% of people who were strongly supportive of guiding. And so the way we essentially combine the strongly and slightly groups to get to our yes/no data, and that's the ones that we presented in the RAC or in the RAC presentation. And so for the no's, we had 62.5%, and for the yeses, we had 14%, and then that neutral group that was in the middle. We also looked at different user groups, and these are people that primarily hunt on specific properties. So we looked at people that hunted on our waterfowl management areas, on federal refuges, the Great Salt Lake, private property, and duck clubs. We wanted to see if there was any difference between where you hunted and how you viewed guiding. What we found was that kind of similar results to what we saw with the entire survey participants. If you start at the left, that dark orange is the strongly opposed, and it was, I mean, between 40 and 50% of people were, again, strongly supportive or opposed to guiding, depending on where they hunted. As you move to the right, you see those different groups. And again, the slightly and strongly supportive groups were pretty small again, being about 7% and 6% for slightly and strongly supportive. We also looked at non-residents. A lot of people had raised concerns that guiding is really important for non-residents. We wanted to see what their survey results were. They were a little bit different than what we saw from the overall number of people, a little bit more support for guiding in the state. But again, we had about 41% who were strongly opposed, about 12.8% slightly opposed. And then on that right side, we had about 2.6% that were slightly supportive and 25.6% that were strongly supportive of guiding. Some other data that we got just to see just how important our WMAs were for the hunting public, for waterfowl hunters. We looked at primarily where people look at or hunting at and user days. And so we found that about 56.3% of user days for waterfowl hunting occur specifically on our waterfowl management areas. And so it kind of shows you just how important our waterfowl management areas are for waterfowl hunters. There's not a lot of places for people to hunt in the state, and so a lot of people go right to these properties to do most of their hunting. As you look at private property, it's about 15.5%, federal refuges are about 10%, and then it goes down from there. We also looked at how many people hunted at least one day on our waterfowl management areas. And so amongst our hunters, about 71% of waterfowl hunters hunt at least one day on our property. And so again, just kind of emphasizing that these properties are really important to waterfowl hunters. When you compare our other properties, our wildlife management areas, we probably get about less than 3% of hunters hunting on those properties. So it's a huge deal for waterfowl hunters to have these properties and be able to hunt on. We also looked at user days on our waterfowl management areas, and we found that Farmington Bay, it's right in the heart of the population center, had about 25% of the user days on it. Ogden Bay has about 19.1%, Willard Spur about 12.8%, Public Shooting Grounds 10.2%, and Harold Crane had 8.7%. And so those 5 waterfowl areas have about 76.3% of our user days. And so those 5 properties are heavily used by our waterfowl hunters. They're also where we see the majority of guiding takes place. And so that's where some of our concerns come, is that a lot of those different parties are interacting on specifically those 5 waterfowl management areas. Some other background information. I looked at all the other states surrounding us in the Pacific Flyway just to see where they stood on guiding. We have 3 states in the Flyway who don't allow guiding on their properties. That's Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Included in that group is also all the federal refuges, and so they also don't allow guiding on their properties. There are some states that allow guiding with some exceptions. California does allow guiding, but they take a large portion of the money that's made from guiding, and that has to go back to the state. And so because it's such a large portion, there aren't any waterfowl guides there because it's just not realistic for them to do that. Oregon does allow guiding, but they don't allow money transfers on their property. And Alaska does, but they require guides to register with the state prior to guiding. And then we have 2 states in the Flyway that do allow guiding on their properties, and that's Nevada and Wyoming. And so just some things to consider. We knew this was a very polarizing issue, and we knew there'd be strong opinions on both sides of the argument. And so we went into it just trying to gather as much background information as we could prior to making a decision. And so we talked with all of our major sportsmen's groups. They were all supportive of some form of regulation on guiding. We talked with our waterfowl managers, and they also were supportive of some regulations on guiding. And so at that point, we wanted to see what the public wanted. So we put the survey out there just to get some feedback from them, just to see if we were where they were at, so we could formulate a recommendation based on what their feelings were. And so based on that, based on the survey data I just presented to you, we felt like our recommendation was in line with what the majority of waterfowl hunters would like to see in the state. One thing to keep in mind, I know a lot of the comments that we've been getting have been in support of guiding, but I guess just keep in mind that a lot of the comments we generally receive through the RAC process are from the people that have more to lose. And so just keep that in mind, that just because a lot of people didn't comment through the RAC system, the survey, I think, is reflective of a lot of those people's feelings for guiding. And also, this is not an outright prohibition on guiding for waterfowl. It's specifically just on our properties. We contain about 120,000 acres of waterfowl properties in the state, which guides wouldn't be allowed on through our proposal, but they would be allowed on any other properties out there. So any other ownership, private property, the Great Salt Lake, the lake bed itself, the sovereign land, really anywhere other than our waterfowl management areas is where our recommendation would be for. And Mr. Chair, that's all the stuff I had to share.
Thank you, Blair. At this time, we'll open it up to questions from the RAC. Just a comment here real quick before we get started. We're going to approach this entire agenda item, which is more than just the guiding piece. But the guiding piece, what we've seen is this is where most of the comments have come in and the concerns have come in. So we will have questions regarding the entire agenda item number 5. When we get to the comment period, and particularly making a motion, we'll separate it out. So we can make a motion regarding just this guiding piece, and then we'll deal with the remainder. But let's go ahead and open it up from questions from the RAC on this item.
Mr. Chair, this is Austin. I have a question.
Go ahead.
We received a comment from Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife with their stance. I just wanted to ask this question to both Blair and to Greg potentially, where SFW recommended that the Wildlife Board and the RACs table this entire topic of guiding on waterfowl WMAs and form a working group. My question is, would that even be possible to do such a thing under House Bill 295? I see that we are constrained to create this permit process. So would that even be possible to table this topic?
It is possible. Essentially, what that directed us to do was to explore a permit process and try to put something in place. And so by going through this process through the RACs and the board, if the recommendation wasn't accepted, then it would be something that we would essentially table at that point and try to work out a better solution than what our recommendations are. And so it would be possible. Greg, I don't know, is there more you'd like to say on that to address HB 295 and how we could move forward?
No, I mean, Blair, you're spot on. We do have an obligation to report to interim committee this fall on any new rules that are passed or rules that are changed in response to HB 295. So we would be reporting our status at that point, even if we hadn't finalized any new regulations. I think we'd still be before interim committee, giving them an update. 295 does prohibit guiding on waterfowl management areas without an annual permit. And so this was, our initial proposal to implement that permitting process. Our lands use rule and our lands program have some mechanisms in place for special use permits. There's some other things that we could use to kind of get us through this initial time period. But I think Blair's spot on. We can make it work in the interim, but I think ultimately we're going to need a proposal, run through our waterfowl rule, ideally, that will address this topic head on.
Chair, if I may ask a follow-up question to Greg on that. So I think it's important for us to understand, and myself, that House Bill 295 became law on May 5th, 2021, as far as I understand. So guiding is now, or commercial hunting on waterfowl management areas is illegal currently as it stands. And so everything we're changing is to do something about that going forward. Is that correct?
So you are correct in that HB 295 is now effective, and guiding is prohibited on waterfowl management areas without an annual permit. We do have permitting procedures in place for a series of other commercial type uses, and not specific to guiding, but other commercial uses of WMAs that could fill that requirement in the interim. I think Blair's recommendation, and I think the division as a whole, would prefer to have something tailored specific to HB 295 in the long run. But if it requires a working group, let's come up with a better product. So I think we do have the tools available to us to make it through and get back to interim. But I think ultimately Blair will be bringing back a second recommendation if this one doesn't move forward.
Chair, this is Austin. I'll ask another question. I've been looking into how the Division of Occupational Professional Licensing works, because they manage guiding licenses, or I should call them registrations now, for big game, cougars and bears. I feel like this whole thing is creating a separate annual permit process that's now tasked to the division or the wildlife board and not to DOPL. Is that the correct way to do that, or have we reinvented the wheel here with a pseudo registration permit process?
Blair, do you want that one, or you want me to give a first crack at it? Okay. So you are correct that DOPL is the agency that administers guiding registrations for cougar, bear, and big game. The text of 295 incorporated a lot of the definitions and provisions that are in the Guides and Outfitters Registration Act into the Wildlife Code and directed the division to administer that program. So I think it's an accurate assessment that it is a parallel program, but it's what 295 directed the Division of Wildlife to do. And currently that Guides and Outfitters Registration Act does not apply to waterfowl guides.
And this is Austin again. To follow up with that, does a big game hunting guide need to have any sort of special use permit from the division to operate on a wildlife management area, which is also a division land, or not?
Currently, we do not require a special use permit to guide for big game on our WMAs. No.
I have a question that I think now would be a good time. The question that I have is, the legislation as I read it asks the division or wildlife board to come up with permits or a permitting process for guiding, yet the recommendation is to just not allow guiding. And then with Austin's questions, part of the discussion was, what would we do to solve this where it is now law and we have to have permits before this waterfowl season? As the division looked into this and worked on this under the direction of legislative action, what did we come up with to recommend a permitting process? Did we come up with any recommendations for a permitting process?
Go ahead, Greg, if you want to start on that.
Blair, why don't you explain what our recommendations is, and then if there are more questions, I can follow up on clarifying that.
Okay, yeah, sure. So HB 295 didn't necessarily, say that you have to allow guiding. It didn't protect guiding or make us have to have guiding. It essentially just required guides to have a permit. And so we kind of started at the very base of, do we even want to allow guiding or not on our properties? And so based on the feedback we got, it was our intention to kind of go with the majority and not allow guiding at all on our properties, which doesn't necessarily go against HB 295. It simply just was us making a decision on guiding. if we were to allow guiding, then we would have to have some kind of a permit process in place. And so we addressed part of that, I guess, with our recommendation is we are still recommending a permit process for guides to be able to use our properties to access other properties. And so along with that, there is a permit process that we are recommending. It's not necessarily just to allow guiding on our properties, but it is something that guides would also have to use our properties just in a different way than guiding hunters.
And I guess, Mr. Chair, if I could add one more clarifying point to that. At the very end of HB 295, there's a savings clause in there that preserves the division's authority to regulate their lands under their land use rule and land use statute and rule. One of those authorities is to regulate or prohibit commercial activity on a property. And so our position, my position and opinion is that the division already had this authority to regulate or prohibit commercial guiding on their properties. HB 295 gave us some direction and a nudge, but it did not take away that authority to prohibit commercial use of a WMA. So Blair's right, there are some recommendations as far as a permitting process, but it is specific for transporting hunters across a WMA. And that would be the main permitting process we'd be recommending today.
Thank you. Other questions from the RAC?
I have a question. So it sounds to me, or are you only doing the permitting process for guides purely to facilitate enforcement of preventing guides from hunting? So on there, because I mean, they're not really engaging in a commercial activity if they're just transiting, right? You know, it's the activities that they're being, paid to do is on the destination property, correct?
Yeah, so they wouldn't be, out there guiding hunters on the property, but they still would be accessing our property. And so we do a similar thing up on the Weber River where we have commercial river rafters that park on our parking lot to access the Weber River, and then they float down. And so we do require them to get a permit from us to essentially park there and cross our property to get access to the river. And so it's essentially just to get essentially people who are doing that activity to register with us so we know how many people are doing it. It also, there's a lot of wear and tear and things on our property, so we can use those funds to invest back into infrastructure and things like that as well. So it's a very similar situation here where they also park on our properties. They want to go hunt out on the lake bed of the Great Salt Lake, but they are using our parking lots. They're driving up down the roads. Their clients are parking there. So it's, I guess, a parallel situation there.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Austin. I have another question. This is probably more for Greg. Greg, can you help us understand how guiding would be defined as it applies to the state of Utah versus transporting, or if I had a passenger for hire license and I took decoys and individuals and I dropped them off, have I guided them if I don't stay in the field? Can you explain some of those definitions to us?
Yeah, I can do my best. And I don't know if we have law enforcement on this call as well. They may be able to provide a little in the field context. But HB 295 incorporated the same set of definitions that is in the Guides and Outfitters Registration Act. And we've also incorporated those and used those in our proposed rule recommendation. So that statute defines what's considered a guide, what's considered outfitting services, what's considered a compensation, which in general is about $100 compensation amount that is the triggering requirement to get a registration through DOPL. So we've used those same definitions and tried to mirror that same approach. We have been trying to coordinate with DOPL to get a feel on how they actually administer that. Is that per hunter? Is that per day? Those are some of the details that devil's in the details, definitely. But our objective is to mirror the same definition and approach that Doppel uses for big game guides.
And one more question to follow up on that. Do all WMAs or waterfowl management areas have to have the same rules as it's written? Do we manage all WMAs in a bubble, or could there be separate rules for each WMA as far as what's permitted and what is not?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I can tackle that. So each one of our WMAs has a specific management plan, and they're managed independently of most other WMAs. Within our waterfowl rule, though, we do have a lot of the same rules and regulations that apply uniformly across our waterfowl management areas. And so in addressing guiding, it's something that we could tackle on a case-by-case basis. The special use permits, we can make them specific to one individual property. For some properties, there's probably going to be a lot more use than there would be on other properties. So we may want to limit the number of guides or, number of clients they can take out or stuff like that. Where we haven't really regulated this at all, it's probably something that we would probably learn as we went along. And as issues arose, we'd probably try to address those through the special use permit. The other thing is it does require them to have an annual special use permit. So they'd have to be applying every year. And so as we saw issues, we could certainly address it the following year.
Yeah, Blair, I agree. Just to add on to that, HB 295 does require the Wildlife Board in their rule to define what we consider to be a waterfowl management area, as well as publish a map of its borders. So you'll see in our red line that we've listed the WMA properties that would be part of our recommendation.
Thank you. Any additional questions from the RAC?
Yeah, this is Verlin. What would the average cost be for a permit? Is there a set cost, or does it vary depending on what you're permitting for?
So it does vary by the activity. We're currently working on a revision of our lands rule, and so there isn't something that's set in stone. But currently we charge about $500 for similar permit fees, and so that's what this one would likely be for this first year.
Did you say that again?
Go ahead. Let's go Nick and then Bart.
I didn't hear the amount clearly. It's how much a year?
It'd be $500 for the annual permit.
Okay, thanks.
I didn't have a question. I just thought $500 is going to definitely be a deterrent to your smaller kind of probably, guide operations where they're just doing it for friends. And so that's going to prohibit that. Or prohibitively expensive.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind, kind of Greg mentioned, is there's that $100 clause in there. And so, I mean, people taking their friends out, as long as they're not charging their friends $100 or more, I mean, they won't have any issue doing it. And I guess I would argue that if you're charging your friends $100, take them hunting, they may not even be your friends. So.
Chair, this is Austin.
Austin.
One more question. Do we have any guesses or ideas from the local WMA managers of how many guides or pseudo guides are using the properties to cross right now and or guiding on the properties? Do we have any numbers we could put to that?
That's a good question. So we know there's probably at least 3 or 4 companies out there that are legitimate businesses. They have web pages, Facebook pages, advertising for clients that are actively doing on WMAs that we've been able to identify. And then there's a whole list of people below that who are advertising on KSL, through Facebook. They don't have really any way to track them. We don't even know who all of them are, but there's at least a dozen that we're aware of that are also currently guiding on WMAs, just doing it on a smaller scale than some of those bigger groups. But yeah, the actual number, we don't know for sure.
I have a question. So anecdotally, in a lot of the comments, people said that, hunting on a WMA was where I was able to get my first swan, and, talked about the great opportunities the WMA's offered. Is there any, is it one of the reasons that they're doing this also to relieve pressure on the species, or is it purely just access?
So I guess, Bart, is your question that is it impacting the resource?
Did that go into your consideration in proposing this rule, considering, pressures on the species?
Not so much. Waterfowl are just very, they can move around all over the place. And so because they're so mobile, a lot of times if they get a lot of pressure in an area, they'll just leave and go somewhere where they're not getting pressure. So there's probably not as much of a concern for the species as much as it is just a human issue and just a lot of people in a small space. And generally, as your pressure increases, the hunting quality tends to decrease as well, like it would for, I guess, any species.
Thanks.
Any additional questions from the RAC?
Yeah, it's Greg. I've been on for a little while. But, is if we lock the guides off from the wildlife management areas, what alternatives do they have? How much of the good? I'm not a waterfowl hunter, so I know nothing about it. But how much good area is there left for them to hunt?
So there's really the entire state they can hunt on. We manage about 125 or 20,000 acres that would be considered waterfowl management areas. We manage those properties to be high quality waterfowl habitats. So they do attract a lot of birds, but there's plenty of other areas out there. There's a lot of sovereign lands on the Great Salt Lake that people are currently guiding on that wouldn't be impacted by this. All the agricultural lands, reservoirs, lakes, really anywhere in the state where you can find waterfowl, they'd be able to guide on still. And many of them do. A lot of the guiding that currently happens in the state is on private property, such as cornfields for geese or mallards or situations like that still have plenty of access to.
Braden, this is Austin. I'll ask one more question in regards to that. I think it's important to remember that no guide licenses or permits are required on private lands. Now, a lot of this seems to come down to the swan hunters, and I've had a swan tag myself. Of course, I didn't get one because I didn't hire a guide, right? But where are there enough properties to swan hunt as a guide service outside of where they can operate federally? And if you take the WMAs away, or where are we left? We're in southern Utah. What is left for swan hunting up there if you take this away?
So there'll still be some areas for people to hunt on. Some of that would be private property, which the guys, would have to secure access to. Some of it could still occur on the sovereign lands of the Great Salt Lake, but a lot of our swans do primarily use our properties or the refuge. Really, the Bear River Refuge holds, a vast majority of swans that we have in Utah. They stop over kind of in that whole Box Elder County area around the refuge. And so guiding currently isn't allowed there and hasn't ever been allowed there. So already there's a lot of people that are just going there and can't use a guide. So
I wasn't going to ask this question, but I'm going to tie this to Austin's question now that he asked that about swans. One of the guides and outfitters up there called and discussed this with me and some of his concerns. And a statement he made, and I can't verify that it's true or not true, but it seems reasonable anyways, is that in his guiding career up there on the WMA, that they have never had a client harvest a tundra swan. And again, I'm not overly familiar with the WMAs up there, so excuse me if I say something wrong here, but my understanding is that they are on a quota, and if you shoot too many tundra swans, that they're very regulated and it shuts down the whole hunt. that seems to be a really positive statement to say that they've never had a client shoot one. I believe last year the hunt was shut down early because they'd reached that quota of tundra swans. Do you have any comments to that? I just thought that was an interesting statement. It seems to be a valid positive for guides.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely been a concern for us because the last 2 years we've had to close the swan hunt down early. And so we put a lot of effort into trying to encourage our hunters to not take trumpeter swans. It still happens, whether or not, it's a guided or non-guided hunter. We don't really have any data on that. But it is a concern that we have been able to find more trumpeters in the state the last 2 years. And they're pretty consistent now. And so, it is a potential that people will want to come to Utah to specifically harvest trumpeter swans, which, guiding would be a good avenue for that. And so it could potentially increase it. But like I say, we don't have any data from the past to say whether guiding has influenced those numbers or not.
All right, any more questions from the RAC? Let's move into comments. Sorry, Nick, did you have another question?
No, if you're moving on to comment section.
Yeah, let's move into comments and we'll give it to you, Nick. Go ahead.
Where you've got an area where there's WMAS and there's private land and they transition from one to the other, how on earth do you possibly enforce, the permit issue or any other regulation that surrounds those that are trying to hunt on those properties? I just can't imagine how you do it.
Thanks, Nick.
Mr. Chairman, this is Chuck. I had a comment related to Nick's. I guess my concern might be that we have a few hunters. It sounds like one that registers and a few guides that really are top notch, and then we have a few that are sliding under the radar. And my worry would be that we would lock out the guys who've been the most cooperative and the most who've tried to register and do what they've been asked to do, and then the guides who are going to slide under the radar and just say, "Hey, I'm not guiding," and they would go out there and hunt anyhow. So it almost feels like we might punish those who are trying to obey the law and not and not make any difference in the numbers or in the guiding out there.
Thanks, Chuck. Other comments?
I'll make a comment, Braden. This is Austin. My comment is, I guess, a little bit more of the big picture. I worry about the Division of Wildlife taking on this permitting process and without having everything that goes into it. I look at other states that I participate in where they have a fish and game department, then they have a DOPL or professional licensing department, and then they also have a commercial services department or a board that handles everything to do with commercial services. And I feel like we're asking a lot of the division, and I know we must due to House Bill 295, but now all complaints on guide complaints and everything is going to go against the division or to the wildlife board instead of to the program we already have where guides must register to become a hunting guide or outfitter. I feel like this almost isn't a guide issue with the Division of Wildlife. This is a special permit only. And considering them as guides or hunting guides is almost the wrong terminology, would be my comment. That we don't have guide organizations in Utah. We don't have the infrastructure needed to make these decisions. As a RAC member, I sit here and I listen to the Waterfowl Association, who is obviously not in cahoots with the guides that are lobbying for a different request from us. I feel like we've made a mess not using the system that's already there. If the division would like to go and create a commercial services board and start doing allocations and start having the competitive proposal process, which they have, where you could bid for commercial spots on a WMA and you could be awarded a certain use or a certain day or a certain month or whatever it may be. I think that could solve a lot of these issues and keep the guides and the public happy. But with our 5 lines of rules here, I don't feel like it's going to make anybody happy enough on both sides of the scale. So those are my comments to start.
Go ahead, Bart.
So, based on all the factors I read and kind of, seems the rationale for this, I mean, in general, this seems kind of like a good, immediate solution to the problem. I think $500 does seem to be a lot. And I understand the $100 and you should be able to pay for it, no problem. But there was no number. I think, Austin, you mentioned, we're going to limit. Could you have a quota? Are you thinking of establishing a quota? Which I guess is a question, not a comment. But I generally think this is a reasonable approach. It's something that you're required to do. You may not have the infrastructure to do it, but the bill requires you to do it. So we have to do it. And this seems a reasonable solution. Will you consider quotas?
So Bart, that is a question, right?
Yes, the last part was, besides me saying the idea.
Okay, yeah, so currently we haven't. I guess we just had come with the presentation to just not allow it at all. If it was to go forward and allow guiding, it's probably something that we would just allow anybody to get a permit the first year. That would give us kind of a baseline, and then we would probably adjust based on demand and other things like that. So does that answer your question?
It answers it. No, it doesn't. My question wasn't about allowing guiding on the WMAs, because that's what you're not allowed to do. You're allowed to transit through. Will you limit those? I mean, because if you don't limit it, you're still going to have a lot of traffic, and that's the purpose. One of the concerns is the impacts and the occupier parking lots, things like that. Will there be limits on the number of permits, or do you think just the dollar value will create a natural limit?
Yeah, so that, again, I'd probably be, I guess my same answer as the other scenario. We'd probably just allow anybody to get one this first year. At that point, I mean, if we had specific areas where we just had people day after day after day taking out tons of clients, it is probably something that we would look at limiting the number of people that use that area. And some of the concerns that we've heard have been that exact thing. Late season, you can go out to the lake and you can hunt green winged teal. There's a whole bunch of them, and it's pretty easy. And some people have had issues with being able to use our parking lots because there's so many people out there during certain times of the year. And so if that was because of guiding and clients being out there, then we would certainly want to address that so that we allowed the public to also use that area and not be, not be able to even park there to go out and hunt that area as well.
This is Dan. I have a comment. I think Austin made a really good point about what is the actual guide use in all these WMAs. Do we have that hard data? And with that, if we don't have that hard data, even if we do, it seems like we need to form a working group to work through these issues. Because if you have some of the WMAs that you can manage for guides, some that you don't, at least it opens up that opportunity for everybody. There are really good comments on both sides of the issues. I know all the other members read through them, but my email, I got tons of email in support and in opposition as well. So it seems like with the issue that we need to form a working group or recommend that to the board to go through that process and come up with a little bit better solution that might work for everybody.
My comment would align just with what Dan said. When we're dealing with, most other issues, wildlife issues, we're working with working groups. We're bringing interested parties together. We're looking for the input and trying to come to a satisfactory answer that all parties can buy into. And this one just feels like that we're bypassing a step that we've established, that we've found to be productive, we've found to be beneficial. And I understand we're trying to get it ready for this season, and we also have a bill that's directing us to take some action. But we've seen success with the process that we've used. That would be my thought: is use those working groups and bring this back.
I like what you just said, Braden. I've got a problem with you make a permit, but the permit won't let you permit for guides, but the permit won't let you guide. That don't make a lot of sense to me.
Mr. Chair, this is Austin. I'll make a comment. I think when House Bill 295 came out, this was almost the overlooked portion, as we know. First it was trail cameras and baiting, and then it just became baiting. And a lot of us never looked at this waterfowl section. And I fear for the guides, is I do respect them as members of the public, that they saw this in there and they said, okay, I will still be able to guide on a waterfowl management area, but there's going to be an annual permit process, and the public or the non-guided hunters get their opportunities preserved. And I feel like they went along with that and let the bill pass as is, and communicating with their representatives and such. And now the guides appear to feel like the rug was pulled out from underneath of them, and that the division has now changed their mind or interpreted differently how they were going to enact that. And I feel like it's an education thing or an understanding that wasn't portrayed to the guided hunters and to the guides who stand the most to lose. And I feel for them. And then we sent a survey to back up, what we were going to do. And overwhelmingly, the survey received exactly what we expected it to. Most hunters don't go with guides, and therefore they want to keep it that way. We don't inherently like change. We don't want to give our opportunities up to the rich guys or the guys with more money than us. I want to take my decoys out and hunt. So I feel like the rug kind of got pulled out from under the guides unexpectedly. And I would say we do need some sort of working group or association or a board to come together to figure out what to do in the future. For the time being, if we're going to follow what the division's recommendations say, to ban all commercial use except for transit only, and to follow the survey results, that's probably what the public is telling us to do. But I do believe it's going to open up for either a lawsuit or new legislation, because we're allowing division lands on wildlife areas to be used by guides, but we're not on waterfowl lands. And is that fair? I feel like that opens up a new can of worms, but it may be the right way to go to make changes going forward.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, Austin and Braden, that I don't know what we got to do to satisfy the letter of the law as far as that bill is, but I agree. I think we need to go into the working groups and come up with a better plan than what we have right now.
Yeah, this is Verlin. I agree too. And I think you got to do a working group, because it's possible to get what you want to do by the fee that you charge to license these guys. Just like you mentioned, California, nobody guides because they can't do it because it's too expensive. And I'd like to say comment too about surveys. I just took one last night, a DWR survey about landowner problems with wildlife, and it felt to me like the questions that were asked were skewed to the answers you wanted. And so when you talk about some of these surveys, and we see it all over the country, these surveys that are done that tell, whether it's whoever's doing the survey, it gives them the answers they want. And I felt like the questions I was answering on that survey had an underlying motive, and whether it did or not, the questions that I would have liked to answer weren't there. So when you talk survey on whether it's waterfowl or whether some of these others, I wonder what can be. It seems like you can get what you want by asking the right certain questions. So I'm a little nervous about the survey. You really made a lot of guides in the state upset. I've never had that much response from one group. I mean, it wasn't just one organization. It was several different people that guide. And so I think this bill has caused some problems that I think a working group would help. And in that group, you could set the price of the fees so that maybe these guys could live with and not end up outpricing them. But that's my comment.
Any other comments from the RAC?
Mr. Chairman?
Good to see you, Tammy.
Well, I don't know about the seeing part. I'm trying to keep my camera off. I think these last few comments have been really, really important. I think that we're a little too hasty in pulling the trigger on this, and I think I like the working group proposal that these guys are talking about, and I really like Dan's comments, and I think we're just ahead of ourselves. We found this in the legislative session. There was a lot of bills that changed and morphed and tweaked into a bunch of stuff that we didn't like, and we're stuck with them. And I think that the working group way is probably the most efficient way to work through the painful part of this. I'm like Verlin, those comments, this is something that I would have never thought about, or, I'm not familiar with the guides or the waterfowl stuff. That's just not my wheelhouse, but I'd support a motion on that to either table it or recommend the working groups.
Thanks, Tammy. Additional comments from the RAC?
Chair, this is Austin. I'll ask Tammy a question to follow up with that. I think it's feeling like we're going to recommend some sort of working group or some future change or group to convene to consider future changes. But I think we need to ask ourselves, what are we going to do this year, and what would be the best course of action? Because it seems like we're out of time to make any changes for the 2021-2022 waterfowl season. That now is the time.
And that I don't know. I mean, I think the question was asked to Blair. Was it Blair that, is this something that we table, or do we, is this bill forced us into making a decision for this season?
Mr. Chair, I can address that a little bit, I guess, from the division perspective on timelines and what we can do, if you'd like me to.
Yes, please, Blair. And I believe Greg addressed that earlier also, but if you can address that, Blair, that'd be great.
Yeah. So we can certainly convene a committee. Coming up with a solution, I guess, prior to the waterfowl season in September probably isn't realistic at this point. But we can certainly do that to try to work through the issues and have something at a later date. We currently do have a process in place to issue special use permits, and we do it quite frequently on all of our properties for commercial and other activities that happen there. And so it is something that we could probably issue special use permits to anybody that wanted to guide on our properties this year, also, if that's the direction you guys wanted to go. So I guess just to give you our perspective of the division and what we would be capable of and some of our timelines.
Thank you, Blair. I think that does answer. Does that answer your question, Austin and Tammy? Does that satisfy it?
Yeah.
So I just want to clarify. Sorry. I just want to clarify. So it sounds like if we wanted to, we could recommend issuing permits this year while we put together a working group to get some data and come back with better data and make a decision in the future for long term. And for a short term fix, we could issue the permits and still be in compliance with the bill. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. We could easily accommodate that.
Yeah.
And this is Austin. Just to follow up with that, Blair, the whole special use permit process and all the requirements are already in place in your modifications in the recommendations today because they're there for the transporting portion, but it's just banned for the guiding. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. And so depending on, if you wanted special stipulations, you can make that in a motion for us to address with the permits. If not, we could easily just issue people permits just based on if you want a permit, apply, we'll issue the permit, and the criteria for what would qualify as a guide could be addressed at a future date.
And just to be clear, one more question, that to get the special use permit, a guide does not even have to be a guide with DOPL. Like, I know there's been a guide saying I'm registered, I'm licensed, but that is a whole separate issue we're talking about. This, they would still not have to register with DOPL. They could just get the permit from you and call themselves a hunting guide as the division, correct?
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, so even our permits don't necessarily qualify as a hunting guide. It's basically just a piece of paper that says you can participate in these activities on our property. And so, yeah, any other licensing or anything like that wouldn't have to apply to them. It would just be something you would apply for to do that specific guiding activity on our WMAs.
I believe the comments have kind of aligned. I believe we may be ready to entertain a motion. I would suggest, based on what I'm hearing, that we would have a motion on this specific item, the guiding portion, and then a separate motion to accept the remainder. If we're ready for that, I think we may want to entertain a motion on the guiding portion.
I'm going to leave that up to one of you guys, and I'll second it.
We already have a second, and now we need a motion.
Come on, Austin.
I'll just make another comment. I recommend, or I am representing the public at large, and so something has to be pretty blatantly obvious to me to go against the division and against the division's survey as a representative of the public. I feel like the waterfowl is first, or the wildlife, and then now we're talking about the public, which comes second. So the public says that we should support this recommendation as it's proposed, but I also agree that we should create a working group or some sort of committee to figure out what to do going forward. But I understand if I move to propose that we're cutting guides out for the first year at least, and that's where my hang up has been. I don't know how everybody else feels.
I appreciate that, Austin. I actually think that's a really valid point. We do have a survey with a lot of participants from the division that did give the division, the information to make the suggestion they're making. So I appreciate where you're coming from there, Austin. This is kind of obviously, I think we all felt like this would be a very simple RAC until our email box is filled up.
I'll make a motion that we table the discussion and set up a working group to study it, and in the meantime, go ahead with with licensing by the DWR, special use licensings or whatever they call it.
Okay, so let me see if we can restate your motion here, Verland. So you're making a motion to table the current recommendation and ask the division to issue permits for this year while we set up a working group and bring a proposal back. Would that be, did I accurately state that motion?
Yeah, that's right. And with the issuing of the permits, it'll fit with the bill that we have to follow.
Braden, can
Okay,
I restate it as I captured it? Because I captured Verlin's thoughts and was still typing while you were restating. So let me make sure I've got it for the minutes. Okay.
All right.
I've got that the motion is to table the discussion until a working group can be formed to make recommendations on guiding and issue permits under the current rules for the coming season.
I think we're good, right, Verland? That sounds right to me.
Yeah, I will go with that. Yep.
So let me ask a question to clarify that. Will that cover all the bases as far as the bill goes, so that nobody's in trouble on that end of it?
Greg and Blair?
Yeah, I think that would be fine for us. We don't have any issues there.
Yep, I would be comfortable with that as well.
Okay, because these guys said, I'm worried about your guides that are already been in there. And if we can, kind of give them a year permit till we get all the rest of the bugs worked out, I feel better about that. So as long as that's clarified, I'll second the motion.
Okay, so we have a motion by Verland and a second by Tammy. Any additional discussion?
I have
Go
a
ahead,
question
Bart, and then
about
Chuck.
special use permits and the mechanism and the process for that. Will that be a simple process, or is that just another difficult process that we're asking for them? What's the price tag for a special use permit timeline? Will these people know how to do it? Are we asking more administrative hurdles for you all to get that information out?
So we have a specific team within our habitat section that issues special use permits. I had talked with them prior to the RAC meeting, and it sounded like they could, or the RAC process, and it sounded like they could process those applications and get them out to people in a timely manner prior to the waterfowl hunt. So I think it's definitely something we could accommodate.
And would it be similar to the other permit process you were talking about, where after the season started, there would be no more special use permits allowed, or continuous?
I believe it's continuous. And so if you applied for one mid-season, you would be allowed to basically use that for the remainder of the season.
Okay.
Blair, maybe just
Chuck,
to put this is
go ahead, Greg.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just to put a fine point on that, Blair, and in recognition of the workload that Habitat section would have to go through to get some of those permits issued, they'll process them in a timely fashion, but until they receive their permit, those guides and outfitters could not operate on a WMA. They need to receive the permit in hand in order to comply with the bill's provisions. But sounds like Blair's coordinated with Habitat section, and they've committed to make that a smooth and quick time turnaround. Just to make clear, they need to have a permit in hand before they would guide.
Thanks, Greg. Chuck, do you have a comment? Oh,
A couple questions, one for Verlin and Tammy, and then one for Blair. And for Verlin and Tammy, when you say permits, issuing permits, are you talking about just to pass through WMAs, or are you talking about guiding on the WMAs? And then the question for Blair is how many permits are we talking? Do we think we're issuing hundreds of permits, or dozens, or 20? I don't know.
Chuck, do you mind if I answer your first question? Because the motion as written is a recommendation on guiding and issuing permits. So it'd be issuing permits for the guiding as the recommendation is written.
Okay, I wasn't completely clear on that.
Yeah, and Charles, in terms of permits, I would assume it'd be probably a dozen maybe 24 at the most.
One question, Mr. Chair, this is Austin. Just to clarify once again on the motion we're voting on, we're tabling, the word table the discussion just means we're going to have a working group in the future, but we're going to issue permits both for crossing, transiting across the WMAs, and operating on the wildlife areas for this year.
Correct.
So basically,
Okay, we've got a motion. Oh, go ahead, Tammy.
One more comment. So the way I would understand it is it would be kind of keep status quo because they're already doing it right now. They have been doing it or they have not been doing it.
Well, here would be the piece that's not status quo. The bill requires that they would have to have a permit this year. And so that's the piece that's not status quo. We're allowing a process to get permits this year. We're tabling coming up with a recommendation until the working group can be formed and come back with a recommendation for what we do in the future.
Okay. All right.
So to clarify, that means per the rule, they can't hunt on WMAs, or we're going to recommend they can.
They can't guide on WMAs this year until they have this permit.
Okay, so.
Okay, so we have a motion and we have a second. Any additional discussion on the motion? I think it's probably time to vote on the motion. So let's go ahead and vote. Austin. Yes, go ahead.
Just so that you're aware, Chad has dropped off. We've got everybody else here. So as you're calling for votes, I think Chad lost his connection, but we do have everybody else.
Thanks, Kevin. Austin?
Yes.
Bart?
No.
Gene?
Yes.
Riley?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Chuck?
Yes.
Verland?
Yes.
Craig, sorry.
Yes.
Tammy?
Yes.
And Dan?
Yes.
And Bart, would you like to state a reason for the no vote?
I prefer to go with, the division is recommending no hunting right now, and that's what I think we should go with. And, the ad hoc, I'm fine with no hunting there, basically from a lot of the comments that I've read, a lot of the guides. We aren't doing anything right now to prevent the bad actors from doing the squatting on sites and basically taking over the spaces. And so that's why I'm voting no. But I do like the idea that we're not implementing a new permitting process when we have one in place already.
Thanks, Bart. Appreciate that. The motion carries, what is that? 8-1? 9-1. So motion passes. Now for the discussion regarding the remainder of agenda item number 5, the waterfowl and rule amendments. We didn't have any questions on the remainder. Do we have any further discussion on the remainder?
I do have a kind of a question, I guess, seeing how I missed part of the presentation. Was there any other RACs, the northern RACs and that had concerns or different recommendations on what the proposal was? And maybe you guys
for the remainder?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Blair, could you answer that? I don't believe so, Tammy. I watched the other racks. But Blair, do you remember?
Yeah, I don't think there's even been questions about it. I think it's just been something that flew right through.
That was as I've watched them, the remainder was pretty simple.
Leave it up to the southern RAC to, confuse things.
Yeah, why can't we shoot sandhill cranes down here?
So Vernon, we have been actually trying to work towards having a crane hunt in the southern part of the state through Sevier County. We know there's a lot of cranes in that area, so it's something we're trying to work through, but it's with the Fish and Wildlife Service, so it's a big extended of a process, but we're working on it. Hopefully we'll get you on someday.
Vernon, I actually like that question. And Blair, I heard you discuss this, and it's really based on depredation. But I have heard discussion that we are seeing depredation in southern Utah. I believe what you just said is they are looking at it. So they are actually researching that and looking at the amount of depredation we are seeing in southern Utah from the cranes. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. So we get very, very few permits that we can actually issue for the state. It's usually less than 200. So we've directed those to the areas with highest amounts of depredation, which traditionally hasn't really been southern Utah, but we are starting to see more and more of that occur down here, which is why we're getting more and more serious about a hunt down this part of the state.
So what about the swans? Because we actually had a bunch of swans on Minersville Reservoir this winter.
Yeah, so that's something we've discussed as well. That's another flyway thing that we'd have to work through with all the states in the Pacific Flyway. We haven't gotten a lot of swans. I mean, primarily 99% of them end up in the Great Salt Lake and then they head towards California. So we've had some in the past come down the southern part of the state. A lot of times they end up being trumpeter swans. And so we're kind of working through some of those details as well. But if the opportunity ever presented itself to expand that area, it's certainly something we'd be interested in doing.
Okay. Well, I will make a motion to approve the rest of the recommendations then.
So we have a motion on the table to approve the remainder. Do we have a second on that?
I'll second it.
I'll second it.
A second we'll give this one to Craig by seconds, Merlin. So second by Craig. Any discussion? All right, let's vote. Austin.
Yes.
Bart.
Yes.
Gene.
Yes.
Riley.
Yes.
Nick.
Yes.
Chuck.
Yes.
Verlund.
Yes.
Craig.
Yes.
Tammy.
Yes.
And Dan.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. So agenda item number 6, the electronic meeting and rule amendments. Boy, for some reason that was a tongue twister. Any questions from the RAC on that agenda item? Any comments from the RAC on that agenda item?
I have a comment and kind of a hybrid question, but as we make these rule changes so that we can have better electronic meetings going forward, Kyle, could you tell us a little bit about what that could look like as far as live participation virtually in a RAC meeting, so we can understand a little bit what to look forward to?
So I unfortunately can't articulate much for the hybrid plan. The director's office is still working on how that would work. I've been asked in a previous RAC about how live participation online could work. And that's a good question that I think should be taken up by our tech department. But the goal is to provide the most flexibility and the most public input. So if we can get people to participate live feasibly with an efficient meeting, I'm sure the director's office is looking at it.
Would these modifications allow us to participate remotely as a RAC member as well? Would that provision be there if we couldn't make the meeting?
Yes. Yeah, so that's one of the main goals with the revisions, is to bring it up with what's currently available for the Wildlife Board, which is if you don't have a quorum, you could create a quorum using an online meeting and notice that properly and not violate the Open and Public Meetings Act.
Thank Thank you. Any additional questions or comments? If not, we'd entertain a motion.
So just one more question, if that's okay. I mean, it feels like when reading through this, that really all we're voting on now is to increase flexibility in our meetings. Is that, I mean, because there's no specifics. So is that, I mean, is that all there is, or am I missing something?
No, as far as being compliant for public meetings, that's the only changes. In the future, hopefully soon, we'll have a hybrid protocol draft that can be discussed in more detail. But at the moment, it's just these edits.
Well, I'll make a motion to accept the proposal as it's listed now.
So we have a motion from Chuck to accept as presented, and I believe, Tammy, were you going to second that?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All right, let's vote. Austin?
Yes.
Bart?
Yes.
Gene?
Yes.
Riley?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Chuck?
Yes.
Verlin?
Yes.
Craig?
Yes.
Tammy?
Yeah.
And Dan?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We have one final item on there. It's a regional presentation. Oh, sorry, that's just the northern region. That won't be for us, correct? So that is everything for this RAC. Next RAC meeting would be August 3rd. Time to be determined. Do we want to determine that time right now? We've been doing, under this digital format, we've been doing 6 o'clock. It seems to be a nice standard time for everyone. Is that the time we'd like to do the next RAC meeting?
Mr. Chair, would that, if that goes in person, would that be in Cedar City on that rotation?
Most likely, Austin, it would be in Cedar City. We're currently looking at 2 locations that would have the bandwidth that we would need, one in Cedar City and one in Richfield. Both would accommodate us probably at our regional offices in Cedar City, our new DNR office in Cedar City on Main Street, and then the new DNR building in Richfield are the 2 options if we were in the hybrid system and some people in person. So I guess the question is, if we are in person, is 6 o'clock okay, or do we need to be a little bit later to allow travel time? Because there is some members of our RAC, like Berlin, that if it's in Cedar City, that's an hour and a half, 2-hour drive for him. So Berlin, I guess I would defer to you as the farthest away on a time.
Well, you say I'll be there. This 6 o'clock's the middle of the day anyway.
That's what I was going to say. Don't ask a farmer. Swing at 9 when sun goes down.
We could, if we ask Verlin, it could end up being at like 4 a.m. when he gets up and gets going. So let's be careful here.
Yeah, you better watch out.
Sleeping bag. We might all have to bring a sleeping bag.
Gene's got a 2-hour drive as well.
Yes, he does.
At least. And he'll be dodging cows on that road.
Not really a problem for me.
I think everybody's okay with 6 o'clock then, Braden.
Okay, let's go ahead and set that at 6 on August 3rd. Unless there's anything more that we need to discuss or any other business that people want to bring forward, we will go ahead and adjourn.
Thanks, Braden.
Thank you,
Okay,
everyone.
thanks, Braden. Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Pray for rain, everybody.
Good night.
Have a good summer.